Welcome to the Chapter 10 overview, the worlds of European Christendom, 500 to 1300. Main idea: Christianity became the dominant cultural commonality in Europe during the post-classical era, an era in which the region struggled to regain the political strength enjoyed during the height of the Roman Empire. Relevance. In our world today, there are many competing international agencies that attempt to correct problems in the world. Some, such as NATO and the EU, which is shown here on this map, are based on the strength and authority of Europe, which are relatively recent developments in world history. Many current issues, such as religious conflict in Jerusalem, are rooted in traditions and events that go back centuries, such as the Crusades. The Christian world today is separated theologically into three main groups, and this chapter explains the first split that created two groups. Setting the stage. In this unit, remember to pay attention to the chronology of chapters. The last chapter focused on China and also covered the years 500 to 1300. Now we're turning our attention to Europe with the same time span. So just be aware that events in these chapters happen concurrently. You'll have an opportunity later to look at the timeline of the unit as a whole. The historical significance of the year 500 in Europe is that it is just after the fall of the Roman Empire, which most historians place at 476 CE. Remember that barbarians from the north conquered Rome, claiming the western part of the empire. So this area, you might remember the Germanic-speaking peoples from what says Germania here on the map, came down through the western part of the empire, eventually conquering Italy. As you'll see in this chapter, the eastern part, which is over here, in where it says Anatolia, remained intact, centered around Constantinople, the trading city founded by Constantine, the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity about 150 years before the fall of Rome. After the empire fell, though, Rome still had a pope who persisted as the leader of Christianity, at least in the west. So we had Constantinople, which is right where this red line ends, right here, sort of being the center of the eastern part of the empire. And we still have a pope in Rome, right here, who is the spiritual leader of Christianity in Western Europe, even after the empire fell. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe regressed as the barbarians destroyed the fabric of civilization. This era includes the time period known as the Dark Ages. As you will see, various international relationships and Christian connections helped to preserve aspects of the culture, laying the foundation for the Renaissance in future centuries. So the first red heading is about the eastern part of the empire, Eastern Christendom building on the Roman past. From its beginnings as a state preserving the structures of the Roman Empire, Byzantium developed as a uniquely Christian empire that dominated Eastern Europe for centuries. The Byzantine state. As the map shows, the Byzantine Empire was never the size of Rome. In fact, the dark yellow here is really the Byzantine Empire after Rome fell. In the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian attempted to reclaim the territory that was once Rome with limited and temporary success. And that's the diagonal lines here in yellow. This is the territory Justinian managed to conquer, but it did not last as part of Byzantium. For most of its life, Byzantium was centered around the eastern Mediterranean Sea, a critical location for economic development, as you will remember from Chapter 8. Remember the Red Sea down here links to the Indian Ocean, and also that the Silk Roads coming from the east terminated in this region of the world, and so Byzantium had that connection. In the Byzantine state, political power was concentrated on the emperor, who wielded supreme authority, often with religious overtones. So, the Byzantine Church and Christian divergence. The result of this mingling of political and religious authority was a system known as Caesaropapism, in which the emperor was both head of state, or Caesar, and head of the church, or pope. The emperor appointed the leader or patriarch of the Christian church in Constantinople, and also presided over religious councils, which over time answered some key theological questions in a manner that distinguished itself from the pope in Rome, creating a split in the church between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths. In this picture, Constantine in the center is presiding over a council of bishops in Nicaea, which reminds us of the religious authority of the head of the state in the Byzantine Empire. The rest of this section explores the causes and effects of these religious differences between East and Western Christianity. As the centuries progressed, cultural and political differences between East and West created an atmosphere of suspicion that magnified theological differences. Basically, Rome and Byzantium disagreed on basic questions, such as the nature of the Trinity, and there was a major conflict over paintings using icons in religious scenes. Most important, though, was the fact that the Pope in Rome claimed authority over the entire Christian world, while in Byzantium, believers in Eastern Orthodoxy rejected that claim. These disagreements would turn violent during the time of the Crusades, which is discussed later in this chapter. Byzantium and the world. This section discusses ways the empire interacted with its neighbors. Its ongoing struggles with the Persian empires to the east weakened both opening the door to conquest by Arab Muslims, which will be covered in the next chapter. Byzantium was also extremely important economically, anchoring the maritime trade of the Eastern Mediterranean. The widespread use of the gold coin called the bezant, shown here, demonstrates this. The empire also helped to preserve Western culture, especially classical Greek learning, transmitting it to the competing worlds of Islam and the Christian West. As mentioned earlier, the Renaissance may not have been possible without the attention to the Greek legacy paid by the Byzantine Empire. Another important cultural contribution was the spread of the Orthodox faith to the north, helping to unite Slavic cultures, setting up the most significant expansion of the faith into the developing state of Russia. So on this map, this shows religions, and the green is Roman Catholicism, which we'll learn about more in this later in the chapter. The yellow then is Orthodox Christianity, so it's centered around Constantinople and Byzantium right here, and it moves a bit into Greece and part of Eastern Europe, and then up here to the north it's spread to Russia. And the orange on this map shows other religions, and a critical one that you'll learn about in the future is Islam, which is primarily to the east of Byzantium and then down here into the Middle East and North Africa. So, the conversion of Russia. Up to the 9th century, there was no Russian state. Beginning in that time, a political structure known as Kievan Rus began to form around the city of Kiev, which is shown here on this map. Religiously, this area was very diverse, and its leader, Prince Vladimir, decided to choose Orthodox Christianity as the official state religion to help unify the people of his new state. This was a critical development both for Russia and Europe, as it helped to create a more unified state on the border of the Islamic and pastoral lands to the east, while strengthening the political position of Byzantium. So for nearly 1,000 years, Byzantium developed a new perception of Christianity, that would be the Eastern Orthodox faith, while politically and culturally preserving Europe's past. Now we turn our attention to Western Europe, rebuilding in the wake of Roman collapse. Relatively isolated by geography and technology, Western Europe developed internal economic and political connections while maintaining Christian traditions from the late Roman Empire. Political life in Western Europe. This section begins by describing the devastating effects of the fall of the Roman Empire, which basically amounted to the collapse of Western civilization as a whole. For instance, the population of Rome fell from 1 million at its height to about 10,000 in the 10th century. Into the political vacuum created by this collapse stepped the Germanic tribes that had conquered Rome. During the Middle Ages, peoples such as the Visigoths, Franks, and Saxons created distinct states in the former Roman Empire, and this map shows some of them here. The rulers of these states saw themselves as successors of the Roman tradition, and many of them converted to Christianity. The most important of these was Charlemagne, who on Christmas Day in the year 800 was crowned emperor by the Pope. On the map to the left here, in a red outline, all the colored areas outlined in red here is the territory controlled by Charlemagne at the time of his conversion, and this was very significant for Christianity. After Charlemagne, a political entity called the Holy Roman Empire was created under an emperor called Otto I, and again that's in the center of the map here in sort of a greenish color. This Roman Catholic state was an effort to revive the Roman tradition and create a political force that could counteract the growing power of Byzantium. It generally failed, but did play an important political role in Europe while helping to spread the Christian faith to the western parts of the region. Society and the Church. Western European society was organized by a system called feudalism. In feudalism, you have the king, then the nobles, then the knights, and then most of the population as peasants. And this diagram has a good example of what each group provides to the other. So up the left, we have the peasants moving upwards, what they provide, and then what is provided going down on the right-hand side. This hierarchy had the benefit of creating social order, reinforcing the power of the elites, and providing food for larger and larger states. As you read and take notes, compare feudalism in Europe to other systems of social organization, such as the caste system in India or the bureaucracy in China, looking for similarities and differences. Feudalism provided political stability while the church provided cultural cohesion. The church supplied rulers with political authority by proclaiming that kings ruled by divine right. During this time, missionary activity helped to spread Christianity throughout Western Europe, often by combining Christian traditions with local ones, such as the celebration of the birth of Jesus on December 25th. While monarchs and the church often cooperated, they also competed as well, generally over questions of power and influence. Accelerating change in the West. For the first half of the overall time period in the chapter, about 500 to 1000, Europe was constantly threatened by invasions from a number of directions. From Muslim lands in the south, primarily from North Africa, and that is shown by these green arrows right here, They're also threatened by Vikings from the north, shown in red here, and finally by the Magyars in the east, shown in this bluish arrow here, coming from what is labeled as Hungary, which is the homeland of the Magyars. By 1000, these threats were largely gone, and both population and agricultural production increased. This is a common theme in world history. More food equals more people equals more food, creating an ongoing cycle. This in turn sparked a growth in trade in two main areas. In the northern coastal areas, especially along the Baltic, that's up here, and England was heavily involved in that trade, and also along the Mediterranean, down here, centered around major trading cities like Genoa and Venice. Here's Genoa here, and Venice is over here. Cities grew as a result, but as your book points out, the great cities of Europe were still substantially smaller than those in other regions. The roles of women also changed with this increase in commercial activity, with women having more responsibility and membership in professional associations called guilds. However, towards the end of this time, as industries became more mechanized, the economic roles of women changed again. Europe outward bound, the crusading tradition. After 1000, the states of Western Europe were growing in power and influence, and Byzantium was declining under the pressure from the Muslim Arabs and Turks in the east. On this map, you see that in green is the Islamic territory, and in this blue color is the territory of the Byzantine Empire right here. And the slashes represents territory that was part of Byzantium that was conquered by Islamic states. So you can see that Byzantium is shrinking quite a bit. And one manifestation of this growing influence of Europe was the Crusades, which were a series of holy wars aimed at ensuring the security of Christianity on earth. Most of these wars consisted of invasions of Jerusalem, which is here, and other holy areas, with the goal of reclaiming them from Islamic control. You can see on the map that Jerusalem and the Holy Land are in green. Other crusades targeted Muslim control of the Iberian Peninsula, that's over here, and Orthodox Christian lands in the east. As a whole, the Crusades represented political and cultural expansion of Western Europe, with varying degrees of success. This expansion has significant cultural, political, and economic effects. As you read, look for examples of ways in which Europe benefited from Arab scholarship while intensifying cultural conflict with rival religions. It established patterns of conflict that persist to this day. The last red heading is called the West in Comparative Perspective. While Western Europe saw major advances during this time period, it still had political, economic, and cultural limitations in comparison to more established civilizations. Catching up. The title of this section sums up how Europe began the era at a disadvantage, but used the increased interconnections of the time to surpass many cultures in the area of technology. Many Europeans recognized the technological disadvantages of the time, borrowing heavily from Asia in particular. For instance, from China alone, Europe learned about the compass, papermaking, gunpowder, and more. You may remember these technological advancements in China from the last chapter. The voyages of Marco Polo helped to spark interest in trade with Asia, leading to increased connections that made this borrowing possible. Over time, Europeans made advancements of their own, such as the invention of a wheeled plow, shown here, for heavier soil, and also crop rotation. These developments helped to make the population growth of the time possible. New sources of energy were also explored, especially wind and water power, which moved industries away from relying on human or animal power. Finally, Europeans, of course, made gains in the art of war, using gunpowder and cannons to master artillery. Pluralism in politics. A major and important difference between Europe and states like China is that after the fall of Rome, there was never again a major empire in Europe. Instead, during the post-classical era, smaller states began to form that brought Europe towards the map we're familiar with today. So this map of Europe is starting to look like the familiar one. France is starting to take shape. This is going to become Spain and Portugal. The Holy Roman Empire will turn into Germanic states like Germany and Austria. And we have Poland and Hungary, and of course the beginnings of Russia. There was a strength in this phenomenon, for constant competition between these smaller states sparked growth in military and navigation technology as well as in trade, creating strong incentives for individual states to get ahead. Thus this era set up Europe for its dominance on the world stage after 1500. Another important development was the increasing power of merchants, which accelerated the transition to capitalism, which was also a key to Europe's power in the future. The last section is called Reason and Faith. A central cultural issue for Europe at this time was a tension between the traditions of Christianity and Greek rationalism. Major universities were born at this time and encouraged intellectual thinkers to explore this issue. As you might expect, some people chose to emphasize Christianity and some rationalism, with a third option to provide a rational foundation for religious belief. These struggles remind us of the central importance of thinkers like Aristotle in European intellectual tradition, and these questions would resurface during the scientific revolution much later. This section ends with a description of how the learning of classical Greece was received by Byzantium and Islamic civilizations. Simply put, Byzantium and Islamic states were largely responsible for preserving that learning, which was picked up and advanced in Western Europe when they were ready. This reminds us that the story of human progress depends on enduring connections between seemingly disparate cultures. Now the 10-second spice review. The feudal system created strong social hierarchies in Europe, with the Byzantine Empire in the east and smaller states in the west attempting to revive the political strength of ancient Rome. Advancements in technology contributed to population growth, while Christian traditions dominated cultural developments. The growing strength of Europe was facilitated by expanded trade and communication. And the visual summary, there's a lot going on in this chapter. So chronologically, remember, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we have a split of European Christendom between the Byzantine Empire in the east and those smaller states in the west. The big religious split, of course, is Orthodox Christianity in Byzantium and Catholicism in the west. And you should think about the characteristics of each and definitely use spice. The chapter talks about social and political and technology and environmental and economic characteristics. And the sum of those as a whole, though, is that Europe's power tends to grow. And don't forget, as the chapter ends with reminding you that really what that means is the fall and the collapse of Byzantium is coming and the West is growing. So you can think of Rome as being the time that all of Europe is powerful, and then in a kind of a seesaw effect, you've got Rome falling and the East rising, and towards the end of this time, 1300, East is falling and the West is rising, and that's going to set up the next unit, and when we return to Europe, which will be the Age of Exploration and the height of Europe's power. That's your Chapter 10 overview. Happy reading!
How can you stop the rain from falling down? Tell me, how can you stop? Oh,